Marcus Webb was 39 years old, and for 5 years he had been, to most of the world, the man behind the counter. He wore the same dark green apron every morning. He drove a '09 Civic with a cracked rear bumper he kept meaning to get fixed. His regulars called him Webb, just Webb, and he never corrected them or offered the first name. He made coffee the way a man makes everything he takes seriously, without theater, without flourish, without needing anyone to notice how good he was at it. He had owned Meridian Coffee on the corner of Calder and Wren in Charlotte, North Carolina for 11 years, and in all that time only a handful of people knew the place belonged to him. They thought he was staff. He let them think so. The apron helped. She came every morning at 6:47. Her name was Eunice Farrow, and she was 71 years old, and she always ordered a medium dark roast with 2 sugars and a splash of oat milk, and she always left $3 on the counter before the cup even touched her hand. Not in the jar, on the counter. Folded, deliberate, the way older people handle money, like it still means something to get it right. For 5 years, $3 every morning. He had never asked her why. She had never explained. The morning she didn't come back, Marcus stood at the counter for an hour before he admitted to himself that he was waiting for her. Then he untied his apron, folded it over the register, told his shift lead Dominique he'd be back by noon, and went to find her. What he found would cost him more than he was prepared to spend and give him back more than he knew he was missing. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in low and amber through the east-facing windows and laid itself across the counter in long, slanted panels the way it always did in October when the sun had stopped pretending it was summer. Marcus had been up since 4:30. He always was. There was a ritual to opening that he had never delegated and never planned to. The unlocking, the grinding, the first pull on the espresso machine to make sure the pressure was dialed, the wiping down of every surface with a towel he wrung out himself. His hands knew the order without asking his brain. He had built this corner of Charlotte with those hands, not metaphorically. The shelves along the east wall, reclaimed pine from a demolition on Beatty's Ford Road, he had sanded and mounted himself on a Saturday in 2019, with his Uncle Clarence holding the level. The tin ceiling he had sourced from an architectural salvage yard in Gastonia, each panel cleaned and fitted over 4 weekends. The floor was black and white hexagonal tile he had set himself after watching 3 YouTube videos and ruining 1 bag of mortar. It had taken him 11 years and 5 renovations to make the room feel like what he had always seen in his head. His grandmother, a woman named Odessa Webb, who had run a small catering operation out of her kitchen on Beatty's Ford for 32 years before her knees gave out, used to say that a room told you who made it. Strangers don't leave the same fingerprints as family, she'd tell him, pressing her thumb to a window she'd just cleaned, looking at the smudge. That's how you know whose house you're really in. Odessa had passed 6 years ago in the spring, 2 months before Marcus finally paid off the first mortgage on the building. He had kept the news to himself for a while. She would have liked to know. Most mornings the shop opened at 6, and the first hour belonged to what he privately called the commute current. Working people, nurses finishing night shifts, tradespeople, a few professors from the college 12 blocks north who clutched their phones and barely looked up from the counter. He knew their orders. He liked knowing their orders. He liked being the thing that ran right when everything else was still figuring itself out. Eunice Farrow was not part of the commuter current. She was her own category. He remembered the first morning she came in. He had been behind the counter, and she had walked in with the posture of a woman who had decided decades ago that she would enter every room like she belonged there. Tan coat, a small leather purse that looked 20 years old and well kept, silver hair pulled straight back. She had looked at the chalkboard menu above the counter for approximately 4 seconds. The same menu she would look at every morning for the next 5 years, always for approximately 4 seconds, as though confirming it had not changed overnight. It said, medium dark roast, 2 sugars, a little oat milk if you have it. He had it. She tasted it, nodded once as though it had passed a test she hadn't announced, placed $3 on the counter, and left. He didn't even know her name until the 3rd week, when Dominique had taken her credit card for a pastry and said, "Thank you, Miss Farrow," and Marcus had filed it the way he filed most things, quietly in a place he could find it later. He did not know where she lived. He did not know if she had family. He knew she walked because she never came in holding car keys. He knew she was from somewhere with softer winters because the first cold snap in November always made her take a moment at the door before stepping out, as though recalibrating. He knew she liked her coffee the same way every time, and that she tipped before she received it, which meant she was paying for something she had already decided she trusted. On the Tuesday in the second year that she'd come in looking tired in a way that went past her eyes and into her posture, he had added a second splash of oat milk without being asked. She had noticed. She hadn't said anything. She had simply placed the $3 down and touched the rim of the cup with her thumb before picking it up, which was not her usual gesture, and he had understood it to be something. The morning of October 14th, 6:47 came and went. Then 7 o'clock, then 7:15. He watched the door with the patient, lateral attention of a man who had trained himself not to stare at things he wanted. He told himself she was running late. He told himself she had a doctor's appointment. He made her order anyway, medium dark roast, 2 sugars, the splash of oat milk, and set it at the end of the counter the way he would if she were just late. He held it for 20 minutes. Then he poured it out, which was the hardest small thing he had done in a long time, rinsed the cup, folded his apron, and went to find her. The only thread he had was the direction she walked. Every morning she came from the north, which meant Calder Street above the intersection, which meant any of the residential blocks running up toward the old Druid Hills neighborhood. He had watched her cross at the same corner 500 times. He knew the pace of her walking, not slow but deliberate, the stride of someone who was paying attention to the world around her, rather than moving through it automatically. He drove north on Calder and parked at the community board outside the Methodist Church on the corner of Wren and Aldersgate, where the neighborhood association posted notices. He did not expect to find anything there. He expected to stand there and think. He stood there for 3 minutes before his eyes landed on a handwritten notice pinned to the bottom left corner, the kind that came from a printer running low on ink. It said, Eunice Farrow, 74 Calder Street, AP4. Wellness check requested. If you know her, please call. There was a number at the bottom, a 704 area code. His hands did not shake. He took out his phone and photographed the notice and started walking north. 74 Calder was a brick building that had been a small apartment house since at least the 1960s. 4 units, a buzzed entry, a row of aluminum mailboxes in the foyer. The front door was propped open with a doorstop, which told him the building did not maintain the kind of security that required a key during the day. He walked in. He found apartment 4 at the end of the second-floor hallway. He knocked. He waited. He knocked again. The neighbor across the hall, a man in his late 50s in a postal service jacket who was clearly heading out for a shift, opened his own door and said, "You hear about Eunice?" Marcus said he was. The man's name was Donald. He said Eunice had been taken by ambulance 2 mornings ago, the 12th. He said he had heard the fall. Said it sounded like something heavy and quiet at the same time, which was a description Marcus understood immediately. He said the hospital was Carolina's Medical, 30 minutes south. He said her daughter in Greensboro had been called, and he hadn't heard back. He said Eunice had given him her spare key 2 years ago in case of exactly this. She always said someone would come looking eventually. Donald told him. I thought she meant family. Marcus thanked him, went back downstairs, sat in his car for 90 seconds, then drove to Carolina's Medical. He did not know why he was doing this. He knew exactly why he was doing this. Those were 2 different thoughts that were both true at the same time, and he held them without resolving them, the way his grandmother had taught him to hold contradictions, like holding 2 different hand tools, one in each hand, and trusting that eventually you'd know which one the job called for. He had built things his whole life. He recognized when a foundation was in trouble. He recognized when something worth keeping was about to be lost by accident. At the hospital, he spoke to a nurse named Priscilla at the 3rd-floor desk, who told him Miss Farrow was stable, had sustained a hip fracture, and was currently awake. She asked if he was family. He told her he was a close friend. Priscilla looked at him for one deliberate moment, then wrote room 318 on a post-it and slid it across the counter. He stood outside room 318 for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. He thought about the $3 on the counter every morning, 5 years, folded deliberate. He thought about the thumb on the rim of the cup in the 2nd year. He thought about what his grandmother would have called a person who showed up. To a thing like this, she would have said, "That's just how you were raised." He pushed the door open. Eunice Farrow was sitting up slightly in the hospital bed, the thin blanket pulled to her waist, her silver hair looser than he had ever seen it. She looked smaller in the bed than she did behind a coffee counter. She also looked, when she recognized him, more relieved than she had any particular reason to be, which told him something about the 2 days she had just spent. She said, "Webb." He said, "Eunice." He pulled the chair close and sat down, and they looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have been acquaintances for years but have never quite had the conversation that establishes what they actually are. "How did you find me?" she asked. "You walked north." That was enough. She nodded once, the same way she nodded when a cup of coffee passed the test she hadn't announced. "My daughter's not coming," she said. It was not a complaint, it was a report. "Okay," he said. "We don't have the kind of relationship that produces emergencies." He let that sit. He did not offer a comment on it. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed $3 on the bedside table, folded the way she always folded them, and she looked at them for a moment and made a sound that was just barely a laugh. Not quite humor, not quite grief, something in between that older people sometimes made when they recognized themselves in something. She said, "You didn't have to come." He said, "I know," and that was the end of the explanation. Over the next 4 hours, he rearranged his afternoon. Dominique could close. He learned that Eunice Farrow had been a school librarian for 31 years, retiring in 2009. That her husband, a man named Henry who had driven city buses for a living, had died in 2017, and that she had sold their house in Gastonia and come to Charlotte to be closer to her daughter, who had subsequently moved to Greensboro for a job. That she had lived alone in the 4 rooms on Calder Street for 6 years and had developed what she called a system of small anchors, things she did at the same time every day to confirm that time was still moving and that she was still in it. The coffee, she said, was one of the anchors. "You were part of it too," she said. "You just didn't know." He thought about that. He thought about how many people he had served across that counter for 11 years, and how many of them he had been a part of without knowing. He thought about anchors, and what it meant to be one for someone without ever having agreed to it. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen on Beatty's Ford, which had been an anchor for an entire neighborhood for 3 decades, and about Odessa Webb pressing her thumb to a window and leaving her mark. "What's going to happen?" he asked. He meant practically. "The hip, the apartment, the recovery. Physical therapy," she said. 6 to 8 weeks before I walk right. Insurance covers most of it. I have some savings." She paused. "And I have a very small network." "How small?" "You and Donald," she said. "That's the current inventory." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's enough to start with." He meant it the way engineers mean things, not as comfort, but as a load calculation. What you have is not what you need. It's what you build from. Start at the beginning. Don't skip steps. Over the following 2 weeks, Marcus arranged for a hospital-grade grab bar to be installed in her bathroom. He knew a contractor on Beatty's Ford who owed him a favor, a man named Curtis who had done the original tile work in Meridian, and who showed up the next morning with the bar already in his truck, as though he had been waiting to be useful. Marcus coordinated with Donald to check in on Eunice twice daily during the first week of her return home. He brought coffee every other morning, the right order in a sealed cup, left at her door if she was sleeping. He never made an announcement of any of this. He did not post about it. He did not describe himself as a good man doing good things. He was simply a man who had noticed a foundation in trouble and had applied what he knew. He also called the hospital's social worker on a Tuesday, a woman named Angela who spoke in the direct, efficient language of someone who spent her days navigating the gap between what people needed and what paperwork allowed, and walked through with her what additional support Eunice was eligible for. There were programs. There were resources that required someone to ask the right questions in the right order. Marcus asked them. He had been an owner and operator for 11 years. He knew how institutions moved and where the leverage was. By the end of the call, Eunice had been enrolled in a home check-in program and was on the list for a twice-weekly physical therapy transport. Angela had paused before hanging up. "You family?" "Close friend," and he said, and she said, which was not skepticism. It was recognition. "She's lucky to have one of those." His attorney, a woman named Felicia Drummond, who had helped him structure the building's trust when he first acquired it, had asked him once during a routine review if he had a succession plan for Meridian. He had said he was working on it. Now, Over coffee in her office on a Thursday morning in late October, she asked him again, and he surprised himself by saying, "I might be thinking about it differently now." She waited. "There was a woman," he said, "who tipped $3 every day for 5 years. Not because of the coffee, because of the constancy. Because the place was open and the same, and you could count on it." He paused. "I want the place to mean that to more people." Felicia looked at him over her glasses. She had known Marcus for 9 years and had, over that time, developed a precise understanding of the difference between when he was thinking out loud and when he had already decided something, and was simply giving her the first draft of it. This was the second kind. "That's a mission statement," she said. "Maybe," he said. "It's also fundable," she said, "if you want to think about a nonprofit component." He had not said that. He filed it. He had also, somewhere in the course of those 2 weeks, started bringing 2 cups on the mornings he visited Eunice. He drank his at her small kitchen table, the one with the vinyl top and the single African violet in the window, while she told him about Henry, the routes he'd driven, the riders he remembered, the way he could tell which passengers were having bad days, and would add an extra second to the stop to make sure they got on safely. She said Henry had understood that his job was less about the bus and more about the particular quality of attention you could offer to a stranger in the course of an ordinary thing. You couldn't manufacture that quality. You had it or you didn't. Most people who had it didn't know they had it, which was part of what made it genuine. "He would have liked you," she said. Marcus did not answer right away. He looked at the African violet in the window, which was doing what African violets do, blooming quietly, requiring very little, producing something purple and stubborn and exact. "I think I would have liked him," he said finally. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile with her whole face. It changed the room a little, the way morning light changes a room, not by adding something new, but by revealing what was already there. By the 3rd week, Eunice was moving through the apartment with the walker, slower than she intended to go, and faster than the physical therapist wanted. She was a woman who had spent 31 years in charge of a room, and she had not shed that authority simply by acquiring a hip fracture. When Marcus arrived one morning and found her standing at the kitchen counter making her own oatmeal, he said nothing about the walker pushed against the refrigerator. He moved it quietly back within reach and sat down. She noticed. She said nothing. That was also a language they had both learned to speak. Donald came by most evenings. He was a quiet man who communicated primarily through small, reliable actions, appearing when he said he would, fixing the loose hinge on the cabinet door without being asked, leaving a container of soup outside her door on the nights he cooked. Marcus had asked him once how he had known to ask for a wellness check that first day. Donald had looked at him as though the question answered itself. She always came home at the same time, he said. That day she didn't. Marcus thought about that. He thought about it for several days. He thought about all the invisible monitoring systems built out of ordinary attention. The neighbor who notices the unread newspaper, the barista who sets the cup down and watches the door. Systems with no name, no institutional backing, no budget. Just people who had decided in some small continuous way to pay attention. Real community operated in those quiet rooms. He drove home that evening through streets he had driven 1,000 times, past corners he had documented in his head the way he documented everything, their history, their function, their capacity, what they could hold. His grandmother's voice came to him the way it sometimes did in the car, that a room told you who made it, that you could know whose house you were in by the marks that got left behind. He had been leaving his mark on Calder Street for 11 years. He hadn't known until recently that it was also leaving its mark on him. 6 months passed like water finding its level. Marcus expanded Meridian's hours to 7 days, added a small lending library shelf in the east corner, Eunice's idea, which she had pitched to him like a woman who had spent 31 years proposing library initiatives and knew how to frame a case, and partnered with 2 neighborhood organizations to host monthly open mornings for senior residents at no charge. The expansion cost him $14, zeroed in renovations, and generated something that did not show up on a balance sheet. He hired a second full-time barista, a young man from the neighborhood named Terrence, 23, who had come in looking for a job with a handwritten resume on notebook paper. Marcus had asked him one question: "What's the best thing you ever made for someone?" Terrence had thought about it for a full 10 seconds before answering, which was the correct way to respond to that question. He was hired. Eunice had recovered well. She walked now with a cane she had chosen herself, slim dark wood, not the institutional aluminum kind, and she arrived at Meridian at 6:47 most mornings, medium dark roast, 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk. She sat now instead of taking the cup to go. She sat at the small table by the east window, the one that caught the low morning light in October, and she read or watched the room, or sometimes talked with Terence, who had learned her order by the third day, and had started setting it up before she reached the door. Marcus watched this from behind the counter one morning in March and thought about what his grandmother had meant by fingerprints. He thought about the marks you left on things without meaning to, and the marks things left on you, and the way that exchange, quiet, unannounced, conducted in the currency of regular presence, was the actual architecture of a neighborhood, of a life. He had heard about Eunice's daughter through Eunice only once. She had called in November, finally. The conversation had been brief and civil, and had closed with no particular resolution. Eunice had reported this without bitterness, which was a thing that took a long time to arrive at and meant something about the woman she had become. He had his own version of that distance, a brother in Richmond who sent texts at Christmas, a cousin in Atlanta he saw at funerals. He understood the particular loneliness of people who were supposed to be your anchor and weren't. He had long since stopped waiting for them to become something different. He had built his anchors elsewhere, one cup of coffee at a time. On a Thursday morning in April, Marcus arrived at Meridian at 4:30 as always, unlocked the door, ran through the ritual, and found on the counter, placed there by Dominique at close of business the evening before, a small envelope with his name on it, in handwriting he recognized immediately. Inside was a card. On the front was a photograph of an African violet. Inside, in Eunice Farrow's deliberate cursive, it said, "Henry would have said you are the good kind of infrastructure. I agree." He set the card on the shelf above the register, between the framed photo of his grandmother and a small square of the first tile he had ever set in this floor, cracked during the original installation, and kept because it was the mistake that taught him the technique. He stood there for a moment in the dark before the morning opened, with the hum of the espresso machine finding its temperature beside him, and felt the specific quality of a thing that was earned and not performed, and would not require maintenance to remain true. He was grounded. He was known. He was, in the only way that had ever mattered to him, exactly where he had built himself to be. Some things, he thought, were worth the patience to build right. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.